Let's talk all about AI in business. It's hosted by Brent Muller. Welcome to the Future Proof Podcast.
Hi, my name is Brent Muller, and this is the Future Proof Podcast. Today, I am with Moshe from DreamDaze Tech. Moshe, great to have you. So glad that you're here.
Thank you for inviting me here, Brent.
Yeah, excellent. So Moshe, real quick, just for our listeners, just give us a little bit of overview on yourself and how you started DreamDaze.
Hi, Moshe Joshua. I'm usually known as the CTO of a bunch of different companies. DreamDaze effectively today is a team of about 20 sophisticated technologists, developers, coders, front end, back end, but ultimately we are product designers, right? In the digital sphere, right? And so I have on my team, I have designers, I have product managers, project management as well. And effectively, DreamDaze is a tech lab. So I do not build technology as a service. I build technology as an owner or a partner. I am in the business of equity. DreamDaze, in that sense, is a startup factory.
Excellent. That's very, very interesting. I love that model. And so tell me a little bit about, you and I talked a little bit before our listeners, tell us a little bit about your journey and touch a little bit on, actually, I'll ask that follow-up question, but right now, just kind of tell us a little bit about your journey over the last, 20, 25 years.
I started off as a trader on Wall Street. I morphed into a hard code coder for hedge funds as a fund manager.
Quants before quants?
Yeah, basically, yeah. That was my life for many years. Building automated trading systems and arbitrage multi-strat models ranging anywhere from options and equities and global equities and global options and hedging mechanisms and whatnot, all over the place. There was a moment in time where I had an opportunity to join. I got invited to be the first market maker on Ripple. At the time, I didn't even know what Ripple was.
Yeah.
And through that journey, I started learning a little bit more about blockchain. And from that milieu, I understood immediately that the blockchain, if I were to replace every single program I had written in the previous 20 years of my career, and I had a blockchain, it would have been better, cheaper, faster. That was a big moment for me. But there was a second element to my work life that kept bogging down, where I could, I ran a software consulting company called Renesys for many years. We had about 50 clients and we were doing software development. I had about 35 employees in New York City at the time. And even though we were doing really, really well as a company, in 2008, 2009, when the credit crunch hit and a lot of my clients effectively had to cancel their contracts, right? So what landed up happening was we kind of landed up making a lot of money by having these contracts convert and cancellation fees and whatnot. But I found myself without a business after 6 months. And I started to understand that even though I'm in the service industry, my client's risk was my risk, but I wasn't gaining any of the upside. I was just getting paid flat.
Right.
And that was the beginnings of what DreamDaze is today, in a venture capital mode, but I invest with team, I don't invest with money. So at a minimum, if I'm taking the same risk that my clients are taking, whether they pay me or not, at a minimum, I'm able to gain the reward from an equity appreciation value.
Absolutely. It's funny you say, that's our growth model is similar, right? On the consulting side, it's your skin in the game. I love your model. I actually think you did this ahead of time. right? I think that's a model that was ahead of its time. I think right now it's the best model out there because you're taking the risks off your clients, right? And it just makes so much sense. And why would anyone not want to participate in upside with bringing development resources to accelerate revenue growth? I mean, it's a no brainer. So switching gears a little bit, when we were talking earlier, you had said something very interesting that you've been doing remote work for 25 years, right? But COVID accelerated the business side of that remote work. Like, again, most founders that I talk to, they're like, oh, yeah, we got thrown into the deep end of the pool, whether we liked it or not, right? And so what's been your observation, right? Have you been doing this for a long, long time that way, working that way? It's new to a lot of people. They've adjusted, but they're still pups if you really think about it and how to really maximize this new model.
I think you have really two extremes on the business development side or sales side or anybody non-technical in the sense that technologists, coders, developers have no choice and are forced to work in a collaborative environment with their code. You write code, I write code, and we both have to use each other's code. So we use tools like Git, for example, right, in terms of how we manage that code. And everything is tracked. And Git is like a beautiful, wonderful experience to use. And it's free and it's open source. It's like unbelievable that this beautiful tool exists in the world. When I talk to non-technical people, nobody even knows what Git is. And that is like just a hole in my head, right? Just in terms of how can that be? So I still get, as an example, I still get emails with attachments and Excel sheets and Word documents. And I'm sitting there going, why are you sending this to me? What am I supposed to do with this? You have an entire legal profession sending you versions of documents as attachments, and everybody's using a different version software, their own individualized versioning software, right? And not realizing that they're not collaborating, they're just CYA, right? They're just saying, here, I sent you the work, now it's your problem, right? That's not a collaboration. There are other tools like Google Docs, which are helpful, but even those Google Docs are not being utilized properly because people haven't actually delved into the feature set. So that's a small example of the much larger conversation that bothers me about what you're talking about. But in terms of the pups of the new world working remotely, you do have extreme neophytes. So you have like the older crowd, right? Guys with gray hairs like me, right? That come into it thinking that they're thinking that they can work in a remote environment using the same experiences and the same skills that they have built over their career in an office, in an in-person environment. That doesn't work at all. Then you have the much, much younger crowd, that are used to having everything on their phone and nothing else, thinking that they're corroborating without realizing that there's a human touch to everything, and communication is a very, very important part of how you word things, how you present things, how you formalize your speech, even if you're chatting in Slack, right, with your coworkers, right? You can't slang everything and you can't dumb it down. There's this great 1984 analogy with Newspeak, right? You just remove the verbs and dumb down the language so much that nobody knows what you're actually thinking anymore.
Right.
So there is a disparate nature and an extreme nature to non-technical people working in this new remote environment. But the funny thing is that I use Git as a great example, even though it's one example. If we had more time, I could probably give you.
Right, you could do 100 of those, right?
If lawyers, why are we even using Google Docs and not Git for everything, right? I understand Git might not necessarily work for Excel specifically, but why are lawyers not using Git? It tracks everything and it's visible, and you can do whatever you want. The transparency layer. Another element that I think is important to highlight in this remote way is that transparency in a in a collaborative environment and in a corroboration environment. Corroborative environment? I don't know.
All right, corroborative. Hey, I like it. New term.
Yeah, yeah. That corroborative environment, requires honesty to be a part of your work environment and your work presentation mode in a transparent way, in a way that I don't think people are able to not only recognize, but are not able to even absorb the lesson that everybody is watching and what everybody else is doing.
Yes.
Right? And everyone's so focused on their own job and everybody's so busy doing what they're doing without taking a step back and realizing that you have to communicate within a corroborative environment differently, utilizing tools differently so that we can work productively differently, right?
Yeah.
That's something that coders know how to do without blinking an eyelid. I mean, it's second nature right now, right?
Right. It's subconscious.
But the problem is most developers don't communicate very, very well in English, but they communicate awesome in code, right?
Right.
So ask a developer and a technical guy to explain to you what he's trying to accomplish. He can't tell it to you over the phone. But if he shows you the code, you get it right away. One thing that's uniquely different also with technologists versus business development and sales, since we're talking about it, is coding is the only language in the world that you can see how other people think, which is a weird thing. You and I right now, we have to use English to understand one another. But if I gave you, 10 developers the same challenge, I'd get 12 different logical responses in terms of how to accomplish the same thing. And each developer would have its own signature, like its own thumbprint, its own fingerprint in terms of how they think. And at this point, I could look at code from my team members and I'll know who wrote it without even seeing who signed it or checked it in or anything else. And that's a unique way that technologists or coders and specifically programmers are able to engage with one another, because the code is a representation of who I am and how I think, right, at a sophisticated level.
Absolutely.
In a way that business developers and salespeople and lawyers and everybody else outside of the technical component of a business are forced to use English as their medium of communication. And quite frankly, when you're trying to do something innovative and you're trying to do something novel and you're trying to create a dictionary from scratch, the words don't exist for you to explain your ideas and for you to corroborate and to collaborate with others. And developers don't have these problems. So when you talk about putting all of that miscommunication or potential for miscommunication in a remote workspace, it makes it that much harder and that much more valuable for people to take a step back and focus on how they communicate and how they transparently communicate and the tools that they're using to communicate. Because not only do I have to think about my job of what I'm doing, but I also have to understand and recognize what everybody else is doing as well.
Yeah.
So the standard goes up, not down.
Yeah. And I've seen that firsthand with several clients just recently. I would say in the last couple of weeks, just watching exactly what you said. I could cite many examples of people talking past each other, right, through whether it's MS Teams or it's Slack, and the communication, and then they're over meetinged, right, to death in corporate America for that reason, right? And still, they don't come out of those meetings because they're not using the right tools, they're not using the right collaboration mechanisms to effectively get to what they're trying to accomplish. So I couldn't agree with you more, and it's getting worse. And I'm watching it and the inefficiencies that are coming. So let me pivot you a little bit off of that same topic, right? So as you see this, right, the way I look at it, Moshe, is that what you just tapped on is one big challenging problem on efficiency, operational efficiency. But as you start to look broader, right, founders and CEOs are struggling with, top line revenue growth for sure, right? Where does emerging tech fit in this? And this is why I think it's a great insights that you can bring to the table and cite some of the industries. And then second is, bottom line efficiencies, right? One of which you just kind of mentioned. And where do they attack first? As you look, kind of on the horizon of what you've seen in the past and what is coming, right? Again, our future-proofed outlook of, how do they grow their top line, add automation, AI, data, wherever, those things that you think move the needle for them. Where do they start and what are you seeing?
I think there's
I know it's a loaded question.
No, it is, but it's nice. It's nicely worded and open-ended enough that I can stick whatever answer in there and it'll fit. Right?
Exactly.
I do think that there's an accessibility to building technology that didn't exist even 5 years ago today. I think that there's an ease of use. Part of that is, the AWS hosted platforms and Azures of the world, right? That has become more commonplace. People forget how new it all is, right? And microservices didn't exist 10 years ago, right? Yeah. And today it's a big chunk of the marketplace. Where I think people fail to recognize in the revenue investment sphere is short-term gains is the long-term goal. Meaning, no matter what you do in terms of what you're investing in, you have to recognize that in 3 years from now, whatever you release today, it's already going to be old and it's going to have to be redone because the world is changing so fast. The pace of innovation and the pace of change is happening so quickly, unless you're plugged into the technology itself, whatever you're investing in is already wasted money, right? So the smaller wins and your singles instead of home runs is the better strategy to go for. Just because I'm not saying that the home runs don't exist, but the probability scale is continuously working against you because the pace
right, it's inverting,
so
right?
Right, it's inverting. So
right, because your timeline's shrinking, right? Yeah.
The anything that I release today that's going to be a home run is going to age itself out by the time anybody thinks of an exit. So the exits become harder, not easier. And I like to say, as the CTO of a company, I'm simultaneously the most important guy at the table, but I'm also the least valuable, right? Because I'm completely replaceable. Right? Because at a certain point, no matter what I do today, and no matter what home runs we create, in 3 years from now, everybody's going to want to know, why aren't we replacing this? All of the cobwebs, the world has moved on, right? It happens so fast.
And tech debt piles up, right?
Right. And, tech debt. So for example, and then you talk about tech debt, you also have to consider what's the value of scope creep now. The value of scope creep has exponentially increased, right? Because if I'm planning on building a larger system and knowing that it's going to take me longer than anything that I estimate, it always does, right? Always. And it's going to have scope creep because other shit's going to come down the table and, distract me, right? Yeah. And it's going to increase the timeline. And then, as we build systems, we also learn about what we didn't think about at the outset, right? Absolutely. And then we make the system better. And hey, we can add this feature to the product and that feature to the product, and that scope creep, right, becomes that much more less valuable because as you're extending your own timeline, thinking like the whole thing is upside down now. As you're extending your own timeline, thinking I'm making my product more valuable, really what you're doing is you're working against future-proofing it for yourself because it's longer, right?
Yes.
So thinking smaller and thinking more modularly becomes a much more valuable way of building technology, building a business around it. And that is a very, very hard conversation for salesmen and for business development and for CEOs to absorb because everybody wants to build the bridge made out of concrete when Nassim Taleb has it correct when he talks about things being anti-fragile.
Yes. Right? Yeah. And the anti-fragile model is, for folks listening that don't know, I mean, that is something that you need to adopt in a big way, right? Moshe, I'm probably preaching to the choir on that one, but yeah, we're big on that, on the anti-fragile. So as you look at that, right, and like, what advice would you give to other CEOs and founders, right, to be able to, kind of adopt that kind of mentality? And, if you want to talk about some of the things you've seen, you're in so many industries. I think that kind of, experience would be unbelievable for our listeners.
Don't spend your money before you have it in the bank. Number one, right? Number two, you have to invest in people, not technology. Don't hire people that haven't had success in your environment, right? People want to hire people with success in other industries because they came from corporate America, because they know they had some success in some other big bank or big company.
Right.
In the startup world, that doesn't apply. It's a different monster. It's a different game. If you had a 30-year exec with like a president of a multi-billion-dollar company versus some 30-year-old tech exec who has worked in 3 different startups where 2 of them failed and 1 of them had some seemingly success, that 30-year-old is much more valuable to you just because of the fact that he's worked in this environment before and he knows what to do. I think people in a startup way of thinking are not used to the amount of work that it takes and the number of hats that you have to do, because in a startup world, your title doesn't mean anything, right? The team is small. There's no money. Everybody has to make do, and everybody has to be the janitor as well. So, as a rule of thumb, for every chief, you need 5 Indians. And I think people who don't come from the startup world are the opposite. They come from a corporate world where you have 5 chiefs for every Indian, where 1 Indian is supporting 5 different executives, because they need the report, they need this, they need that. So I think, when you're thinking of hiring people, for every 1 person that you hire, you have to recognize that really you're hiring 6 people, and you have to do it that way, right? You have to hire as a team. I also think in a technology way of talking, right? The business of technology is not your industry, it's not your product, and the value you bring to investors is not sales and it's not revenues. The business is not learning how to manage knowledge transfer. And again, going back to this, coders know how to do this, using these tools like Git and stuff.
Right.
But I think people lose sight of the cost of knowledge transfer, especially in a startup mode where you're trying to do something innovative, let's say, and you're trying to build technology that has its own dictionary of how to explain what we're trying to accomplish when there's no comparative other company that is doing exactly the same thing that you're doing. Otherwise, if it exists, why do you exist as a company, right? So everybody says, well, we're a little bit like them, but we're not exactly like that, and we're a little bit like this, we're not exactly like that. So there's a great way of talking about it, of how do you define a word in a dictionary, right? What is the definition of a word? It's a triangulation of 3 other thesaurus words, right? Of 3 other synonyms to say it's kind of like this, but it's not like that. It's kind of like this, but it's somewhere in the middle, right? And now you have a new definition. But if you do something technically innovative speaking, you have to come up with your own dictionary. And now if you don't have a comparative word to describe what you're trying to accomplish, nobody knows how to speak about it. So in the context of knowledge transfer, right, you have to understand that when you're building a product, there's this magical moment of building your team where you can put enough team members at the starting line at the same time so that everybody starts learning together in like the class of Q1 and Q2 2024, when we hired 6 people at one time, they're learning together. You get to the third
Like a
quarter,
cohort, right? Yes.
the cohort, right? And then when the next cohort comes aboard, who are they learning from? They're learning from their counterparts and they're learning from their coworkers, which in a knowledge transfer business way of talking, you're
Right.
slowing down your business. So in a weird way, knowledge transfer businesses, which technology companies are, there are a few others, but specifically technology companies, works
Amen.
at an inverse of most of the world. Most of the world works on you throw more money at it, the problem gets done faster. You want to build a ship faster? Hire more people, the ship gets faster. You want to build a building faster? Hire more people, hire more construction workers, the building is done
Yeah.
faster. In a knowledge transfer business, you hire more people, everything slows down. Your productivity slows
Right. It's
down.
the inverse.
So right. So the advice I have is to learn how to hire on a schedule, not to hire based on need, right? And to stick to that schedule, whether you need them or not, because your business is knowledge transfer and you can smooth out that volatility of productivity across your entire line. So if you can say,
That's
we're
really
going to be
interesting.
able to hire 10 people over the next 18 months, stick to the plan regardless if you have the money or not, right? Or, you're going to need the money. Or at a minimum, say,
Right.
we have the money to hire 20 people, just hire the 12 people and stick to the plan and don't hire based on when you need, and hire them 4 at a time, right?
Right.
And have those start dates grouped together and have those people grouped together, like 4 people for operations and 4 people for sales and 4 people for, technology, so that they're all learning together in sync with each other. By hiring people one by one based on the need, and you think, oh, we're going to grow as a company and we need to spend, and the sales team needs another assistant or the technology needs another executive, whatever it is, you're just killing yourself.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. My youngest daughter just started in a cohort, right, and in a BDR role, and that's exactly how they did it. But it should extrapolate to, like you said, to whatever role that is higher in teams. That makes all the sense in the world because they do that training, right? And the funny thing is, they have taught their AI training bots how to interact to train the BDRs, right? So that's kind of it's a perfect segue into my next question for you, which is, as you start to think about, Moshe, especially being across the 20 plus industries that you've been experienced in, the challenges of introducing this new technology into making these organizations. It's honestly, to me, AI automation is better, faster, cheaper if done right. Right. And most don't know where to start. So what has been your experience, and kind of what would be your advice to other founders and CEOs in this area?
I actually have a great answer, but before I answer, I want to touch upon this AI business. I
Yeah.
think people don't realize how expensive AI can get, just in terms of hosting it yourself. So it becomes very sexy to go out and hire some of these online platforms. But I think people do not pay enough attention and value to the privacy concerns related to them. There are major, major issues related to you putting your corporate IP and handing it over for free to some other company that is now
Totally agree.
running your chatbot, right?
Right.
So there is a lot of concern that I have in an AI, and that better, cheaper, faster way of thinking does not make you more valuable. It makes you less valuable. So number one, I want to highlight the fact that regardless if you're using AI or not, and I don't want to delve into the philosophical basis of AI, good or bad,
Right.
but I do want to highlight that the decision-making authority, certainly in startups, should always be focused on IP value, equity valuation, and nothing else matters, right? And if you're handing away your IP for free, right, to an AI chatbot, regardless if it's better, cheaper, faster, spend the money and maintain your equity valuation, because that's actually what the business is all about. It's not about your product, and it's not about learning, right? And learning curve. As it relates to, what we were talking about knowledge transfer wise, I think one of the advice I would give, and how we can help, and there's a really good answer, is people do not pay enough attention to the nature of documentation. Documentation is, again, another thing that technologists are forced to do, and do really, really well if they're focused on it. Because documentation becomes a part of the code itself in a way, regardless of, I'm not talking about inline coding and inline comments in code. I'm talking about like actual documentation, English documents that can explain the architectural setup
specs,
of how you're doing
architectural
business
specs, tech specs,
product specs, everything else. The documentation is the teaching tool that you have as content. So when you're hiring more people, you're saving yourself the knowledge transfer drag, right, of those new hires having to learn from their teammates. The idea that a new cohort of a team of new hires can come into a company and sit down for 3 months and go through documentation and not bother all the people who actually need to be productive, right? The first 3 months for any hire is a crapshoot, no matter who they are, right?
Yeah.
So at a minimum, when they come out of that 3-month cave, right, of sitting down in a cave, when they're asking questions and they're finally engaging with their teammates in an office, in a remote sphere, whatever it is, now they're actually learning productively because they have some basis of understanding. So when you start thinking about investing in a documenter as part of your business, as part of your hiring strategy, whether it's part on the technology team, whether the documentation is happening on the operations team, documentation on the sales team, documentation at the CEO level, right? The CEO decision-making authority documentation. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but I think that people think of the documentation expense as how much does it cost for us to pay this person to be there and to document it. But the real truth is it's one of the most valuable resources you have in a company because of how much it actually saves you just from the knowledge transfer and the learning curve of new hires and growth, right?
If it used
Startups
properly,
are all about
right?
growth.
Absolutely.
If used properly. But without the documentation, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. You have to invest in it because it actually has an immediate return on the investment, no matter how much you're paying in the salary of having those people doing the work and building out that content. With that in mind, there actually is, in my world, an answer to the specific question that you're asking, and that falls into the category of roadmaps. So I think in this we talk about collaborative tools, we talk about remote working, we talk about communication, right? I think that there is a mismatch of how people think of how are we going to plan our company going forward, and what are the tools and presentation material we're going to use to present our plan going forward. So you have to present to the board. You have to present to executives. You have to report on your workload, right? You have to account for your bandwidth. There's a lot of things that goes into planning, right? Budgeting, all of that stuff. And I think it becomes super overwhelming when people start looking at a Gantt chart, right? That some project manager created in Jira or whatever it is.
Right.
And nobody knows what the hell is going on because there. So everybody falls into, we'll just create a PowerPoint document. And roadmaps fall into the trap of becoming an art form. And when I say an art form, I talk about it as art as a picture, right? They put a pretty picture up on the screen and they say, this is what we're planning on doing. And here are the highlights of what we're trying to accomplish. But it's wrong. And when we talk about roadmaps as a communication tool of what we're planning on doing, you have to start thinking about it as a task-managed bottom-up roadmap strategy. And the reason why I talk about it that way, and there are a lot of platforms that do something similar with a presentation layer. I personally use Product Board connected to Jira. That's our model. But, there are the Mondays.coms.
There's a bunch.
There are a lot of these product management tools. But when I talk about a roadmap, I think about it department level roadmaps, where the entire company is on the same roadmap in line with each other. So you can't think of a technology company only as a product release roadmap, which is normally how people think of like the ahas and stuff like that. That's wrong, right? Because the sales team needs to have a 6-month window of time of sales, right? So what are they going to do? Wait for the product to be ready and available on the technology side and then start selling it? But then they're wasting time. So everybody wants to do it in parallel with each other, and they want to take the risk of being a little bit wrong and having the buffer time involved, right? Yeah. So how do you develop a roadmap that in a one picture as a visual tool, you can see what the entire company is doing in one snapshot? That's actually a really hard thing to do. But if you recognize that you can build it from the bottom up, what I mean bottom up, I mean, assume you're a task-based managed company, right? So you have project managers, they're distributing tasks, they're making assignments, right? You have product managers distributing assignments, you have executives distributing assignments, and everybody just gets a task and they have to do it and they're doing the task. Well, that platform of task management, regardless of you using it, Trello or whatever it is, Jira or any one of these things, ClickUp, whatever they are. How do you take all of that data and that information of the work that's being done, however it's being done, and funnel it into an automated report that has a presentation layer so everybody can just see what's going on? The key point of all of this is to say, once you have that infrastructure in place, looking at the roadmap becomes a formal process that everybody can just trust and know this is actually what's going on. Whereas if you were just looking at a picture that somebody did in PowerPoint because it looked good and because it made the narrative that everybody's trying to tell the board what they're trying to accomplish, made everybody feel good about it, nobody knows how to trust a PowerPoint presentation, but everybody knows how to trust an infrastructurally solid task management presentation layer because they know that that presentation was not manipulated by human hands. It's just an emergent recognition of what everybody's doing in the company, of all the data. And that, I think, is something that in my company, DreamDaze, we are the owners of about, a lot of properties that we've built over time. But at any single point in time, we're basically running the technology for about 4 to 5 different companies that we're building simultaneously, right, with different partnerships and different industries and stuff like that as equity owners. And we internally have been forced to use these tools and build our own roadmap to be able to track what the hell we're doing ourselves. And are we underperforming? Right? Are we overperforming? Are we ahead? Are we behind? We have to manage expectations consistently because technologists' communication patterns are really important because nobody else can plan without knowing when's it going to be ready, right? Right. That's the
and this goes back to your whole transparency thing, and that to me should be very attractive to any founder and CEO, 100%, because you're right. There's this whole control of the narrative versus, how do we get the whole company on the same page to get the work done, right? And they're not always tied together. And what you're talking about is what is sorely needed, right? Because
I'll even tell you a little bit, on a personal level, like my own bugaboo, right? Everyone has expectations of me in terms of being transparent, right? Everybody wants to know what's going on in the technology department. How's it going? What's happening? We need to know. We have to know what's happening. When's it going to be ready? How do we know? How are we doing, Moshe? What's going on? But nobody meets my expectations of their transparency.
Right.
right?
Especially
So,
sales.
right, and I know why that is. I know the way that is because when you talk about marketing and sales and legal and finance and CEO level business development, right?
Yeah.
Whatever you want to call it, right? They're all English based environments where they all speak the same language. Now, they all have different skill sets, they all have different knowledge bases, they all have different experiences, right? Right?
Right.
They're different expertise, but they can all corroborate around the English language as the normalized communication pattern, right?
Right.
So I may not know how to read a legal document, but I could read it. I may not understand it, the
Right. Right.
ramifications of everything, right? Same thing with sales. I may not know all the decisions that went into the sales deck or the marketing deck, but I can understand it, right?
And you could get a pulse of where it is. Right.
That's right. But technology, code, is a black hole to everybody, right?
Yes.
There's a fear factor that everybody has towards, I don't know what the hell goes on behind that closed doors of the technology department because
Yeah.
they're just speaking a different language. There's no conversational plugin that anybody can understand what's happening. So what they require from me, and I actually take a lot of responsibility to it, they require the transparency from the technology department to be normalized to their world. And by the way, they're 100% right. That's
Right.
basically my job, to manage expectations. But
I'm
that
going through something very
transparency,
similar right now with one of my clients, so I
right,
totally get it. And I'm in your shoes there. I'm responsible for doing that, the translating,
right,
as
the
on the
translation,
consulting
right?
side. Right. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So how do you take, when we speak the technology, we're talking our own language. When the product side talks about product, they're talking their own language. When the business development side is talking about their own language, and the sales side is talking their own language, and the CEO has his own language also about the same product. You're talking
Yeah.
about the same product in so many different ways in different dictionaries, and it doesn't. How do you manage that mapping tool, right? So I think when we talk about using collaborative tools and the new age of remote work and all of these platforms that exist, that transparency is a double-edged sword that nobody is ready for. In terms of the what did you call them? The pups, right?
The pups.
The
Yeah, they're
pups are
pups.
not right. The pups are not ready to absorb the lesson that in order to work in this remote environment, you are forced to work in a transparent environment where you can't hide anymore. And it
Yeah.
doesn't work for a lot of people because their business is CYA mostly, right?
Yes.
They're
Justify
not
existence, and
capable.
yes, totally
That's
get
right.
it.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's a big hard part. So the reason why I talk about this is that we in DreamDaze built our own framework. We call it a framework of how we do product ideation and how we do road mapping. The roadmap effectively becomes the bookends to all of the technology work. So we do our product planning in the
Yeah.
roadmap technology. That gets pushed into Jira, and we manage the technical tasks between the engineering team in Jira. And then all of that Jira now bubbles back out onto the roadmap feature to the other bookend, which becomes the presentation layer, right? And
That's really
uh,
interesting.
right. So that as a framework is actually part of our business that we sell, primarily because a lot of companies want to engage with me for technology consulting work or technology
Yep.
auditing and honestly, I could care less about that business. That's not my business. I am interested in equity. The
Right.
problem is that my engagement is such a high risk for me to learn about your business, to learn about what you're trying to accomplish, to learn about it before I make
Absolutely.
any commitment. My
Goes back to that
commitment
knowledge
level is
transfer, right?
knowledge transfer. It's so expensive for me to engage with other companies in order to learn about what they're doing, just for me to be able to say no. Like, because
Yeah.
anytime I commit to a company, it's a 7-year commitment. There's no way
Yeah.
around it, right? I can't unwind myself and the engineering team away from the company at large, even though we effectively, eventually, after about 3 years of success, we start to replace ourselves with,
Right.
internal employee-based hires in the traditional sense, right?
Right.
But that initial outreach is so expensive for me. I use the DreamDaze roadmap as a framework. I have a team of product managers that manage other companies' roadmaps for them, and I charge them as a service, right? It's
Right.
like a 3-month academy, right? It's kind of like the
Yeah.
Roadmap Academy. It's a 3-month academy where we do the work for them, and then we teach them how to support it and manage it going forward. We do that just so that we can pay for ourselves at cost during that knowledge transfer, just
Yeah.
so that we can engage with the company and decide, is this a company that we want to start taking on the responsibility and the commitment of engineering for them?
But
So
it's a
now that we
great
actually
value
know
for
what we're
them,
working on.
even what
Yeah,
comes
that's
out
the
of that
idea.
3-month roadmap, right? Because most of
Yes.
them, most companies don't do that very well. Has been my
Nobody does it
experience.
well.
Yeah.
Nobody does it. It's mayhem. Startups are just mayhem, right? The
Yeah.
truth is that if you had to lay out all of the things that a startup needs to be successful and actually do make the list, you'd recognize that all startups, 100% of them, they're all miracles. All
Yeah.
of them.
I've been part of a few. You could
Yeah.
not be more right.
Yeah.
So Moshe, this has been unbelievable. I know I'm going to have you back because I've thought about like 6 other things I want to ask you. Unfortunately, we're at time, but I would really like for you to talk to CEOs and founders that are say, hey, that 3-month roadmap workshop sounds awesome, or I want to talk to Moshe and his team about potentially doing that. Can you tell me a little bit of how somebody would get in touch with you? We'll put all the links below when
Sure.
we put this up. But yeah, just tell us, give me a little bit about DreamDaze.
Um, DreamDaze is basically I'm a professional dreamer. I engage with future telling and crystal balls, and then we figure out and say, you know what, that's something that we can build and we should do that, right? And that's ultimately what DreamDaze is. So I'm not. I like to say it in a way that ideas are cheap, but vision is valuable, right? And bringing vision to the table,
Oh, that's a good
defining
one. I
that,
like that.
yeah, ideas are cheap and vision is valuable, meaning everybody has an idea, but knowing how to accomplish it is actually where the work starts, right? And knowing how to plan it
Absolutely.
forward and how. So unless you know the nuts and bolts and where the failures and where the pitfalls are, you can't start a business, right? And so we're really good in Dream Days at software development, but understanding that if you're building a company based on an app, if you're building a website, if you're building an API data layer, if you're building a back-end infrastructure, whatever the technical business is, that business still requires an operations team, a sales team, a business development team. Like
Yeah.
that doesn't go away. So the Dream Days takes ownership of product and engineering, which in my world is 2 slices of a 10-slice pie, right?
Yeah.
So I usually take on the role of CTO for these companies to force forward the vision of the technology and force forward and manage the product creation and product management as well as the engineering of it. But I'm very, very careful of who my partners are
Yeah.
and what
And you
they
have
do.
to
And that,
be. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, actually, that's where the pitfall lies. Finding people who have never done this before is both risky with upside
Yep.
because they're engaged and they're ambitious and they have no idea what they just got themselves into, right? So they're excited, right? And they
Right.
really, really push, right? But finding people who have done this and been successful as real and previously is really, really valuable because you can just shortcut all of the gamesmanship and stuff like that. Doing startups with executives who or founders, doing startups with founders who have never built a startup before is usually not a good idea.
Yeah. I would
And
agree with that.
but that's a catch-22 because if that were true, then startups wouldn't exist, right?
Right.
So
Right.
there's a fine you have to find somewhere in the
And
middle.
there's the human factor that comes in, right? Once you talk to them, to call that out and where that might, because again, there's always exceptions to every rule, right? But it's a pretty good rule that I get that.
I think the Dream Days roadmap, for example, mitigates risk because you're able to define the pitfalls of a communication pattern that most people don't even know is about to occur no matter what they do, right?
Yeah.
And I think that people do not put enough value in terms of their ROI on not just the unknown, but the learning process, right, of failure, right?
Yes.
Not failing or knowing how not to fail is the most valuable resource that a startup can have. And the experience of successful executives in a startup world is the most valuable resource that there exists. And that's why I really like these companies that, another thing that CEOs should be aware of, like creating advisory boards, not as a, a lot of times they'll have like this advisory board with a fancy picture and a bio and saying, hey, here's a guy who worked at some fancy schmancy bank and now they're our advisor, right?
Right.
Hiring advisory
little cachet.
boards,
yeah.
Right, a cache of the PR stunt that is an advisory board. But having a real advisory board and finding people who are invested at an equity level, right? You're giving them equity to engage with you with a vesting schedule and everything else.
Yep.
And you talk to them every month, and they should know what's going on with the sales team, and they will be really, really good at directing you where and how not to fail. That is worth its weight in gold.
I totally
and
agree with
DreamDaze
that.
roadmap is a big part of that, communication mechanism.
Yeah. Well, Moshe, this is a lot of really good advice, and like I said, we will definitely.
We didn't even talk about what industries and
I know.
Yeah, I didn't talk about like the technology that we're talking about.
Well, listen. That's why we'll do a follow up for sure because I just want to make sure that we get some of this out there, and it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I can't wait to have you back because again, I could talk to you for hours on this stuff because I feel like we have very similar experiences, and we come at it from I come at it from the consulting side, you come at it from the CTO side, and I work with a ton of CTOs and CIOs, so I totally get everything that you said, and I hope our listeners really kind of take to this, but if nothing else, I will say that I firsthand experience I can't name a client that does road mapping well. And so just that road mapping workshop and exercise that you do is worth its weight in gold. So I would encourage, our founders and CEOs listening to this to definitely have a conversation with Moshe, and you'll be able to get in touch with him very easily right off of this podcast. So Moshe, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You got it. Thank you, Brent. Talk to you later.
All right.
If you're ready to embrace change and lead with innovation, be sure to subscribe and never miss an episode. Thanks for tuning in to the Future Proof Podcast.